Hi, everyone. I'm Morgan Radford. You are watching NBC News Now, and we are so glad to have you with us on this day of breaking news because we start the hour with horrific news out of D.C. A Capitol Police officer has died, and another is now in the hospital after a car rammed into them outside of the Capitol. Now, Capitol Police say the suspect lunged at the officers with a knife, and that was after getting out of the car. He was then shot and killed. Capitol Police identifying the fallen officer as William Evans, an 18-year veteran of the department, the acting chief of Capitol.
This has been an extremely difficult time for U.S. Capitol Police after the events of January 6th and now the events that have occurred here today. So I ask that you keep our U.S. Capitol Police family in your thoughts and prayers.
Here now, NBC News Now, Capitol Hill correspondent Leanne Caldwell. Leanne is right outside there for us, and you were on the Hill during this incident. You've been there all day, so explain to our viewers what happened, Leanne.
That's right, Morgan. I was on the Hill. I was in the Russell Rotunda, which is a Senate office building where senators and aides have their offices. It's just right across the street from the Capitol. It's actually to my right. And at around just after 1 o'clock, there was a message over the intercom that told that we were in lockdown, that we could not leave because of a security incident outside. Well, that security incident is right behind me. And right behind me, you see not only police tape, but Constitution Avenue. And then there is a ambulance, and behind that ambulance is the entrance to the Capitol, where that car, who is now driven by who we now know as a 25-year-old from Indiana, hit two police officers. One of them has lost his life and ran into the barrier of the Capitol. That is one of the last security blockades before you can actually get in front of the Capitol. So that is what happened today. Of course, the tragic news that the officer, Billy Evans, an 18-year veteran of the United States Capitol Police, did succumb to his injuries today. There's a second Capitol Police officer, who is in the hospital. And of course, we know the suspect, Green, of a 25-year-old from Indiana, he was killed today after being shot at by the Capitol Police after he got out of his car after he crashed it and lunged toward the Capitol Police, wielding a knife. Morgan.
And we also know, Leanne, that just in the past few minutes, the president has released a statement about today's incident. What is President Biden saying, Leanne?
He did just release a statement. He said, Jill and I are heartbroken to learn of the violent attacks at a security checkpoint in the U.S. Capitol grounds, which killed Officer William Evans of the U.S. Capitol Police and left a fellow officer fighting for his life. We send heartfelt condolences to Officer Evans' family and everyone grieving his loss. We know what a difficult time this has been for the Capitol, everyone who works there and who protects it. The president goes on to say that he's been receiving briefings from the Homeland Security Advisor and will be getting further updates as the investigation proceeds. So he mentions how difficult of a time it is for Capitol Police here after, of course, what happened on January 6th. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi has ordered the flags at the Capitol to be lowered to half-staff to honor police officer Evans as well. It's just been a really, really difficult time for members of the Capitol Police ever since January 6th. They've been working so many hours, long hours, getting hardly any time away from here. The morale has been really low, and there is currently a security debate because of January 6th on what the Capitol should look like and how much security there should be. It's a debate that has become very partisan and very political, like many things in Washington these days. But it is a debate that is going to continue, and it's a debate that is likely going to change once again because of what happened today, Morgan.
We have Leanne Caldwell outside. Leanne, thank you so much for being there, and thank you for your reporting. And please stay safe. I know you've been reporting there since the Capitol and before, so we appreciate you being there and keeping us abreast of all those changes. Leanne Caldwell for us. The U.S. hitting a major milestone today with more than 100 million Americans having at least one dose of the COVID-19 vaccine. Now, of those, 57 million are fully vaccinated, which is 17.5% of the population, according to the CDC. Now, on the flip side, we're also seeing signs of a possible fourth surge, and that's with more than half of the country now reporting an increase in cases. This does include the New York and tri-state area where we are right now, and this is 1 year after it was the epicenter of the pandemic in America. New Jersey Governor Phil Murphy warning that COVID could ravage the state over the next few months. Take a listen.
Under this scenario, we're in for a long, hot summer. So please, God, this is not what we have to live through.
The CDC is updating its travel guidelines today just in time for the Easter holiday weekend, saying that fully vaccinated travelers no longer need to get a COVID test before or after their trip unless their destination requires it. As we mentioned, New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut are now all reporting a rise in those coronavirus cases. In fact, in Connecticut, positive tests have gone up almost 55% over just the last 2 weeks. MSNBC anchor Lindsay Reiser has more from Old Greenwich, Connecticut.
Morgan, we did not need a reminder of the human toll that COVID-19 has taken, yet we have one right here at this church in Old Greenwich. Each small white flag represents a life lost here in this state, around 7,900. That number has doubled since this memorial was last erected over the summer. And the pastor here says that it is to help the community collectively grieve. And it's a reminder we are not out of this. In fact, this area is seeing a spike among younger people. The Yale New Haven Medical System says they're seeing a 40% increase in cases in that age range from 35 to 44. And earlier I spoke with the senior pastor as well as Senator Blumenthal, who came to pay his respects. We're going to get to them in 1 second. But I want to talk about the other neighboring states as well. New Jersey, for example, they're afraid that because of variant spreading and spring break travel, that we'll see a spike there, potentially peaking in April. Worst case scenario, not flatlining until May. And this is a really important reminder here. We are not out of the woods yet. And so let's listen back to what the senior pastor here at this church told me, as well as Senator Blumenthal, about the impact that this memorial is having.
It's very sobering, and it doesn't put a face, but it puts the number into perspective. The hope that we're feeling for the new day ahead, it came at significant cost, and this is a reminder of that human toll that we've experienced.
In a way, the flashback for me is a year ago when there were 4,000, and the lives that we have lost since that could have been saved, should have been saved, if leaders had acted more responsibly and promptly. And
Senator Blumenthal says he is pleased so far with the vaccine rollout in his state, but of course, like so many other states, they are still struggling with that supply. He says he is pleading with the federal government to get more here in this state. Morgan?
England is announcing today that it is adding 4 more countries to its travel ban in order to protect the country against those new variants of coronavirus. Sky News correspondent John Craig has more.
4 major countries, the Philippines, Pakistan, Kenya and Bangladesh, have been added to England's red list to protect the country against new variants of coronavirus at a critical time for the vaccine programme, the British government says. It means that from 4 a.m. on Friday the 9th of April, international visitors who have departed from or transited through the Philippines, Pakistan, Kenya and Bangladesh in the previous 10 days will be refused entry into England. Only British and Irish citizens or those with residence rights in the UK, including long-term visa holders, will be allowed to enter. They will have to stay in a government-approved quarantine facility, almost certainly a hotel, for 10 days. This news will cause real concern amongst the large Bangladeshi and Pakistani communities in England. And here, in a separate development, the regulators who control the use of the COVID vaccines have announced that 30 blood clotting cases have been reported in the UK after the first 18 million doses of the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine. This is 25 more than previously known, but the regulators are saying that despite this, the benefits of the jab far outweigh any known side effects. Some countries in Europe, such as Germany, have restricted its use, that's AstraZeneca, to certain ages. But the European Medicines Watchdog and the World Health Organization both say it's safe and effective.
Boost for the travel industry. As we heard just a few minutes ago, the CDC is relaxing some of its travel guidelines for fully vaccinated Americans. Assistant Professor of Emergency Medicine, Dr. Adnan Swaminathan, joins me now. Dr. Swaminathan, the CDC is getting rid of these testing requirements and even self-quarantine for those who have been fully vaccinated. But the CDC director, Dr. Rochelle Walensky, said today that this is still advisement against unnecessary travel. Take a listen.
Our guidance is silent on recommending or not recommending fully vaccinated people travel. Our guidance speaks to the safety of doing so. While we believe that fully vaccinated people can travel at low risk to themselves, CDC is not recommending travel at this time due to the rising.
Thank you so much for being with us, because we're heading into this holiday weekend and dealing with the start of a possible fourth surge in cases. Are the updated guidelines enough to keep us safe, or should they be more strict?
I actually think these are very reasonable science-based recommendations. We've had data coming out telling us that there's a 90% reduction in any kind of case, whether it's symptomatic or asymptomatic, after the second dose. And I think one of the keys here, Morgan, is to remember that it's fully vaccinated people. That means 2 weeks after your final dose, 2 weeks after the first dose of J&J, 2 weeks after your second dose of either the Pfizer or Moderna. And those caveats are really important. We shouldn't be traveling if we don't need to, but it's probably okay if you're fully vaccinated. And I think what this really gives people is another carrot to encourage people to get vaccinated that may be a little hesitant. So I think it's important for the CDC to embrace science and give these kind of recommendations that are measured and informed by the best science that we have. Also understanding that there might be steps back in this process as we learn more. But for right now, I think these are very reasonable recommendations. Don't travel if you don't have to. And if you're traveling, continue to mask, continue to distance.
Which is interesting you say that, because, you know, I've been traveling as reporters. We are still traveling and working throughout the pandemic. And I cannot tell you how many people write me on Instagram or Twitter and ask me, is there anything else that they should be doing if they were to travel? Besides the guidelines in the CDC, is there anything else that you recommend if people finally are vaccinated and want to go see their loved ones?
I don't think so. I think the important public health measures that we've been trying to really stress throughout this are the ones we should keep doing. Keep that mask on as much as you can, distance from people as much as possible, which is tough in an airport. Let's be honest. It is tough to do that distancing. Do the best that you can. But I think if you wear a mask, remember, this is a model where the more of these things that we do, the less likely that you contract or pass to somebody else. So the vaccine, masking, distancing, some of them you're not going to be able to do, but the ones that you can, masking and vaccines, do that before you travel. And if you're not vaccinated, really not the time to be rushing out to travel.
That sounds like really sound advice. But the other side of this is that despite millions of people getting vaccinated a day, we just hit a huge milestone here in the U.S. Still, more than half of the country is now reporting a rise in cases. So what more can we do, doctor? I mean, how else can we really lower the spread? And frankly, what's causing it?
This fourth surge is really heartbreaking, because you're right. The vaccines are ramping up. A month ago, we were talking about let's shoot for 3 million vaccines a day. We're there. We're already there, which is fantastic. And yet we see these spikes. And I think the spikes are due to a couple of different reasons. One is, yes, people are probably getting a little bit of pandemic fatigue. I think that's part of it. The spread of variants is a huge part. But I think that the thing that's really important to look at is the inconsistency of messaging. We have our governors, especially in New York, New Jersey, telling us that we should continue to distance. We should continue to mask, get vaccinated when you have to, when you can. At the same time, we have restaurants open for indoor dining. We have theaters opening. We have increased or really decreased restrictions on how many people can gather for private events. These are big mistakes. With the rising numbers, and let's be honest, we're already in the fourth surge. We should be closing indoor dining. We should be closing theaters. We need to really institute those public health restrictions, and we have to be consistent with messaging. It's too confusing for people to hear we should mask, we should vaccinate, we should distance, but also it's okay. Restaurants are open, theaters are open. Those two messages don't jive. We need to have a single directed message. Let's close these things down. Let's keep those public health measures in place and just a little bit longer. Just hold on a little longer. Let's get the vaccines really ramped up, and then we can catch up, and then people can go back to what they were doing before.
Which is hard because, as you mentioned, that fatigue is real. You know, after doing this for more than a year, people are dying to get back to normal. People are so hopeful to see their family members again. But speaking of which, Johnson & Johnson is now expanding its COVID vaccine trial to include children between 12 and 17. And of course, this is coming just days after Pfizer announced that its vaccine showed 100% efficacy, for those who are between 12 and 15. So are you expecting to see similar results in J&J's trial? And frankly, what's that timeline look like? How long until we actually see those results?
I'm really hopeful we will. And with the Pfizer, this is press release, and we don't do medicine based on press release. We need to see the data. The FDA needs to approve that data and review that data. But this is really hopeful that we're moving into that age group, because those children in the 12 to 17 age group, they basically transmit like adults do. And so it's going to be really hard for us to get back to school without getting that group vaccinated to safely get back and to prevent the frequent closures of schools that we've seen over the last year. So I'm really hopeful that these vaccines do prove to be effective in that group so that we can get back to school. This is really important stuff to do. And Johnson & Johnson is enrolling down to much younger age groups. Pfizer will be doing that. Moderna will be doing that. That information is going to be important. I'm hoping that if the Pfizer data pans out, we can see that vaccine approved up to 12 years old, maybe by midsummer, and for the other two, maybe to lag behind into the fall. And as we ramp up the amount of vaccine that's available, it's going to be really important to reach those groups. And the other key thing in this is the logistics of delivery and vaccinators. We really need to ramp up the number of vaccinators we have, because that really is proving to be a choke point in getting more people vaccinated.
Well, here is to hoping for a healthier summer. Dr. Swaminathan, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. We appreciate it.
Thanks, Morgan.
More than 555,000 Americans have died from COVID-19, according to our own NBC News data. Many of those deaths occurring inside hospitals where, in some cases, the last person a patient actually sees is the hospital's chaplain. NBC News correspondent Ellison Barber followed one hospital chaplain from Mississippi who's fighting this pandemic from the front lines.
Twice a week, Chaplain Doris Whitaker's message of hope,
breathe in peace and hope,
echoes through these halls at the University of Mississippi Medical Center.
Hello, hello. How are you?
She's carried hope to these rooms for more than a decade.
It doesn't matter denomination, faith, tradition. Chaplaincy is a comfort ministry. It's a helping ministry.
But the pandemic made that ministry more difficult. How does a chaplain truly comfort when the virus ravaging so many bodies demands distance?
COVID really came in my life like a wrecking ball.
Whitaker and her family were among Mississippi's first COVID cases in March of 2020.
I was very aware of the severity of COVID really from the beginning.
Fully recovered, she returned to work as infection rates soared and found ways to continue her ministry behind glass. But then one day, an ICU nurse called. Another COVID patient was dying.
He wanted to see the chaplain. My gut knew, go in the room.
In that moment, her ministry was changed.
Tears were flowing down my face. How fearful were you? I was afraid, fearful, and that's part of life. I offered a short prayer, eyeball to eyeball with him. He kind of nodded, and then he gave me a thumbs up. And so I backed away, and I gave him a thumbs up.
An hour later, he died.
Each rock is so unique.
A stone, carefully laid in the hospital's interfaith chapel, is the final physical reminder that he was here.
326 stones, one for each COVID patient that we lost here at the hospital.
When you think back on those faces, when you think back to that first man, his eyes.
Yes.
What do you hope his family knows about that moment?
I want them to know. I I want them to know that he was good. When I looked into his eyes, there was no fear.
How do you keep that person with you?
I remember the preciousness, the privilege, the honor that I had to be there in those last moments.
326 lives. Doris and the 4 other chaplains here spent time with half of them, offering prayer and quiet comfort when their family couldn't visit.
NBC News correspondent Ellison Barber joins me now. Ellison, I have to say, not only was that a powerful interview, but it was also an incredibly well-written story. And I know that a lot of people don't always see how the sausage is made and know that as reporters, we write our own stories. And the way you told it was just incredibly impactful. So first, I have to say thank you. But the question that's burning for me is that it really sounds like these hospital chaplains spend a lot of time, as she mentioned, comforting patients during their final moments. But did Miss Doris ever help anyone who ultimately survived the virus?
Oh, yes. So many. And we actually were able to meet one of those patients who, he didn't know it at the time, but she had been there checking on him every single day. He contracted COVID-19 and was in the ICU because of it for about 3 weeks. He said he was unconscious for most of it. At one point, almost was put on a ventilator. What he found out after he survived, after he left the hospital, was that Doris had come by his room almost every single day, standing by his window, praying for him. Sometimes she said when it looked like he was awake, she would just walk by and give a little wave and keep going. And she said, I had no idea if he knew who I was, but she did it because his son, who is a nurse at that hospital, stopped her one day and said, hey, my dad's in trouble. Can you help us? Can you pray? And she did every single day. And if I can, I want you to listen to a little bit of what that father and son told us.
She saw me and asked how everything was going, and I told her my dad was in the hospital and that he needed help, and she immediately was, absolutely, I will gladly pray for him.
To be a chaplain, it's got to be, you got to have that angel heart, is what I'd call it. To be an angel, when somebody needs you, you can feel that angel.
And that first person there, Matt Harris, he is an ICU nurse. His unit was a COVID unit. He is a hero in his own right, but he says people like Doris are, in his words, the unsung heroes of this pandemic. Morgan.
Ellison, at this time in our country, when we are seeing so much division and frankly a rise in so much hate, I think it's so important to remember that people like Miss Doris are out there. People like that gentleman are out there. And may we all be a Miss Doris for somebody in this life. All right, Ellison Barber, I can't tell you how much I appreciate you sharing that story with us and with me today, because we needed it. Thank you, Ellison. Let's go now to NBC News Now correspondent Simone Boyce, who has been following the latest headlines from NBCNews.com on this day packed with breaking news. Simone, take us through it all.
A lot happening today in Washington, Morgan, and a lot happening around the world as well. That's where we're going to start, with President Biden offering unwavering support for Ukraine's sovereignty during a phone call with the country's president. Now, this comes amid ongoing aggression from Russia's military, escalating tension near Ukraine's eastern border. And remember this story? This was the big story from last week. The Suez Canal Authority saying it's close to clearing the backlog of shipping it had built up after a giant container ship blocked the vital waterway for days. Now, that ship was successfully dislodged Monday. And the CDC is investigating a nasty salmonella outbreak in 8 states. The agency saying it believes the infections are linked to wild songbird and bird feeders. So far, 19 people have been infected with salmonella from the outbreak. And this is a good story that will hopefully make you smile a little bit today. Portuguese soccer player Cristiano Ronaldo accidentally raising thousands of dollars for a Serbian baby. Last week during a World Cup qualifier, Ronaldo angrily threw his armband on the ground, but after the match, it was picked up and given to a Serbian charity who then auctioned it off for, get this, 64,000 euros, raising money to pay for the medical treatment of a 6-month-old boy suffering from muscular atrophy. Can't imagine that Cristiano Ronaldo would not be happy with the outcome of that story, Morgan. So good to see some good news today. I'll send it back to you.
Oh, I love that, Simone. I'm so glad we ended on that note, because that's the news we needed today, especially going into the weekend. Simone, thank you so much. We really appreciate it. Switching gears now, totally unnecessary. That's how Minneapolis Police Lieutenant Richard Zimmerman described Derek Chauvin's use of force against George Floyd. Now, he's just one of several officials retracing those moments leading up to Floyd's death. But this week, we also heard from everyday people who witnessed that arrest. And here are some of those testimonies.
Did you feel threatened by the police officers?
Yes.
Did you feel threatened by Mr. Chauvin?
Yes, I have a black father, I have a black brother, I have black friends. And I look at that and I look at how that could have been one of them. It's been nights I stayed up apologizing and apologizing to George Floyd for not doing more and not physically interacting and not saving his life. But it's like, it's not what I should have done. It's what he should have done.
What's the point of doing chest compressions?
Pumping the blood for somebody that's not doing that themselves, trying to get a pulse back.
And were you able to do that, any of those steps?
No, sir.
Why weren't you able to do any of that?
Because the officers didn't let me in to the scene.
And when you couldn't do that, how did that make you feel?
Totally distressed.
Were you frustrated?
Yes.
I think you made some reference about why you videotaped, because our memories are fallible, right? And again, a stressful situation can impact your memory, right?
Absolutely. That's why we're lucky it was videotaped.
Right. Would you describe other people's demeanors as upset or angry?
I don't know if you've seen anybody be killed, but it's upsetting.
I'm going to just ask you to answer my questions as I ask them to you, okay? Did you describe Mr. Floyd as a small, slim man? Overall.
Yeah, it appeared to, with 3 grown men on top of somebody, it appeared that he was small and frail.
Okay.
But I know that not to be
there's
true,
no
obviously.
question. Your job is to answer that.
I was finishing my answer.
I will determine when your answer is done.
Okay, well...
And so, do not argue with the court. Do not argue with counsel. Answer the questions. Do not volunteer information that is not requested.
Oh my God.
So when you're ready.
We'll just give you a moment, Mr. McDonald. I'm not sure if there's water as well. Oh. If you need a break to get some water, let me know, and we can take a break. I know that this is difficult. Can you just explain sort of what you're feeling in this moment?
I feel helpless.
Go now to NBC News correspondent Megan Fitzgerald, who's live for us in Minneapolis. Megan, I have to be honest with you. I don't even know where to start, because I don't know how you felt hearing Miss Darnella, that teenager, take to the stand saying, I have a black father and brother. Gosh, I mean, I don't know any person of color in this country who didn't see that and kind of feel the same way. And then to see that firefighter display such courage and conviction in her answers. We heard today, Megan, both the defense and prosecution asking Lieutenant Richard Zimmerman about officers needing to, quote, improvise to protect themselves from danger. How did Zimmerman respond to that?
Yeah, well, to the first part of what you said, you're absolutely right. I mean, it's such emotional testimony that jurors heard this week. And then to your last question, you know, what the defense is trying to do is to basically feed into their narrative, which is that officers will do whatever they can, and they should do whatever they need to protect themselves from danger. Whereas in this instance, you saw the prosecution actually trying to put into context the actual evidence, the video that we've all seen, that 9 minutes and 29 seconds. I want you to listen to the exchange, the different exchanges between the prosecution and the defense.
You would agree, however, that in a fight for your life, generally speaking, in a fight for your life, you as an officer are allowed to use whatever force is reasonable and necessary, correct?
Yes.
Based on your review of the body cams, did you see any need for Officer Chauvin to improvise by putting his knee on Mr. Floyd for 9 minutes and 29 seconds?
No, I did not.
And Morgan, also, it's worth noting that jurors were listening intently and taking copious notes, we're told, during the testimony from Lieutenant Zimmerman there on the stand.
So what comes next, Megan? I mean, we know that court is adjourned until Monday morning, but who are we expecting to hear from next week?
Right. So next week, the prosecution will continue to call more witnesses. We understand that we could be hearing from the chief of the Minneapolis Police Department, as well as the chief medical examiner who conducted the autopsy of George Floyd. Morgan.
All right. Megan Fitzgerald, thank you so much for being with us. And thank you for covering this trial from the beginning. We appreciate you being there. Right now, let's bring in former federal prosecutor and NBC News legal analyst Cynthia Oxney and NBC News legal analyst Danny Savalos. Thank you both for being with us this afternoon. And Danny, I'd like to start with you because I want to run that clip back. We just saw that clip of the trial we just saw in Megan's report. So what did you make of the defense's argument that sometimes police officers need to improvise if they feel like they're in danger?
This is a central theme of the defense's argument. I mean, they have two major prongs. Number one, causation, that drugs and George Floyd's bad health caused his death, not the knee in the back. And part two is going to be the maximal restraint technique isn't a felony. It's not inherent. It's not eminently dangerous because it's taught. It's something the police use. Well, now we see the prosecution chipping away in advance at that argument by the use of testimony by officers, brother officers of Chauvin, saying that no, there is, at a certain point when a suspect is immobilized and no longer poses a threat, then there's time. Then you have to take the knee off the back. The threat has passed. This is really, really bad for the defense. They're going to have to come up with something to counter it. They're already starting from behind before they've even put their case on.
You described this as really bad for the defense. Cynthia, let's switch gears for a minute because the prosecution spent a lot of time asking Lieutenant Zimmerman about Derek Chauvin's use of force, as Danny just mentioned. Take a listen to what he said.
According to the training, you handcuff somebody behind the back. What's your responsibility with regard to that person from that moment on?
That person is yours. He's your responsibility. His safety is your responsibility. His well-being is your responsibility.
That prone position is at the heart of what a lot of what we've been hearing. So Zimmerman, of course, also said that a knee on the neck is in fact deadly force. So how do you think a jury will respond to that, Cynthia?
I think it's devastating for the defense. And here's why, and for a couple of reasons. One, the putting a knee on somebody's neck is almost never allowed. And the further use of force experts will say that. But if you add that the person is handcuffed, and if you add that the person has 3 guys on him, and if you add that the person has gone limp, having your knee on the neck is not allowed. And once the jury knows, oh, this force is deadly force, and it's not appropriate, then you've really hurt the drug defense, right? Because now it doesn't matter if the guy has had drugs or not, because you're putting deadly force. And the question for the jury is the force a substantial cause of the death? And once you've called it deadly, you're saying it's a substantial cause of death. So it very, very much flattens the defense. And the other is this whole business about improvise when you're in a very dangerous situation. Okay, Chauvin was not in a dangerous situation. He is completely in control. He's in control, and he sort of has this feel like an Alabama sharecropper enforcer. I mean, he's awful. And in fact, when people are yelling at him, he digs his knee into his neck a little more. So when the defense raises, maybe he has to improvise, everybody on that jury knows he didn't have to improvise. He wasn't in a dangerous situation. Now the defense attorney has hurt his credibility with the jury. And when it comes to closing statements, when he wants the jury to believe certain things that he says, they're not going to believe him because they know he's not the truth teller in the courtroom.
Cynthia, I really appreciate your specificity describing that he was, in fact, in control. And one theme we heard throughout this really emotional testimony from the witnesses this week is that they said they regret not doing more to help George Floyd. So, Danny, one of the biggest moments of the week was yesterday when we heard the ex-sergeant who said that the officers who were restraining Floyd, they could have stopped when Floyd stopped resisting. And that's, of course, something that Lieutenant Zimmerman echoed today. If you were defending Chauvin, Danny, what's your answer to that?
Sometimes you have witnesses that you don't have an answer for. And when you have a sergeant getting up there and saying, I observed the force, and in my opinion, this was excessive, I mean, that's devastating. And sometimes, look, as a defense attorney, there are witnesses you just can't get a lot out of. And in that instance, you should get up, maybe ask one or two pointed questions, or if you have nothing to ask, sit down. You run a greater risk by getting up and asking a bunch of questions against these witnesses who anyone can see. You don't need to be a lawyer. They're openly hostile to the defense, and they're all part of the same government that Chauvin used to be a part of. You don't see that very often. Normally, you see at least the blue line trying to help each other out a little bit. That is clearly not happening here. His own supervisors have looked at this use of force and said it's no good. It's almost more effective than a use of force expert coming in for the prosecution and saying the force was excessive. You have brother and sister officers ostensibly coming in, swearing an oath and saying that this amount of force was unnecessary at this point. It really defeats the defense's anticipated argument that, hey, this technique was taught, it was in the manual. They're basically saying, yeah, even if it was in the manual, it wasn't needed at this point in this particular situation.
Which makes the question about unreasonable force one that we're going to see play out as this trial continues next week. Cynthia, Danny, thank you so much for your candor, because your candor is what we all need to understand this very layered trial and the consequences it's had for our nation. Cynthia and Danny, thank you so much for being with us. Stay with us.
Thank you.
Corporate backlash over new restrictive voting laws is spreading from Georgia to Texas. Today, Major League Baseball announcing it will move this year's All-Star Game and draft from Atlanta over Georgia's new voting law. Now, Commissioner Rob Manfred saying in a statement, we proudly used our platform to encourage baseball fans and communities throughout our country to perform their civic duty and actively participate in the voting process. Fair access to voting continues to have our game's unwavering support. That comes as American Airlines and Dell Technologies both criticize bills that would limit voting hours and access to mail-in ballots in Texas. NBCNews.com senior reporter Jane Tim joins me now. Jane, first let's talk about this announcement from MLB, because it comes just over a week after Georgia's governor signed the state's controversial bill into law. The Atlanta Braves releasing a statement saying they're, quote, deeply disappointed, and adding that this was neither our decision nor our recommendation, and we're saddened that fans will not be able to see this event in our city. So my question for you, Jane, has there been any reaction from those state lawmakers thus far?
Absolutely. I've been emailing a lot of these bill authors to get a sense of what they think. But the people who have spoken so far, Governor Kemp has spoken out and Speaker Ralston of the Georgia House, and they are fighting fire with fire. Governor Kemp saying that the MLB caved to fear, political opportunism, and liberal lies. He blames cancel culture and woke political activists for coming for every aspect of your life. House Speaker Ralston in the Georgia House said that Delta will not be bullied by socialists and their sympathizers. I mean, these are fierce statements. There is absolutely no indication that Georgia lawmakers are going to back down here.
Yeah, I mean, that's hard. We've heard this common refrain of cancel culture being mislabeled for accountability. So let's shift now, Jane, to what's happening in Texas, especially starting with American Airlines, because they're based in Fort Worth. What are they saying about this legislation?
So American Airlines came out, and what's different about American Airlines speaking up is that they're doing it while the bill is still being discussed. Of course, Delta, Coca-Cola, MLB, all happening after the law has already been enacted. But here's what American Airlines said. We are strongly opposed to this bill and others like it. We stand for the rights of our team members and customers who call Texas home, protecting and expanding the right to vote. So this is giving lawmakers a chance to readdress that bill if they want to. You know what I mean? They can actually guide what's happening, and they're coming out early and sort of suggesting, look, we're gonna put our money where our mouth is. We're not pleased with these laws.
But what about the backlash, Jane? Because Texas Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick fired back at American Airlines. How is he defending these restrictive voting bills?
Yeah, absolutely. Lieutenant Governor's statement I have here to Texans are fed up with corporations that don't share our values, trying to dictate public policy. Republicans really do not like it when corporations come out and get involved in the so-called culture wars. And this is really the week that voting rights has become one of these cultural issues. We typically see corporations get involved when it's LGBT rights. We've seen trans bathroom bills get corporate boycotts. But this is different. This is a new one.
It's a new one because, the question becomes, is it actually a cultural war or is it just a civic and a civil right? Jane Tim reporting for us. Jane, thank you so much. We appreciate all the latest and you getting all those statements. Thank you. Part of President Biden's $2 trillion infrastructure plan could lead to a new chapter in America's fight to reduce our carbon footprint. NBC News correspondent Josh Letterman has more.
How much can $2 trillion get you? When it comes to fighting climate change, it turns out a whole lot. Not all of President Biden's sweeping $2.3 trillion infrastructure proposal is focused squarely on climate. There's money for roads, bridges, housing, and a whole lot more. But the big spending on green jobs, renewable energy, and climate resilience would still be the biggest investment ever by the U.S. government toward reducing the greenhouse gases blamed for global warming.
It's a once-in-a-generation investment in America, unlike anything we've seen or done.
At the heart of Biden's plan is what's known as a clean electricity standard. If Biden gets his way, utilities nationwide will be required to use a certain percentage of power from renewable sources like wind and solar. That percentage can be ramped up over time, so eventually we'd phase out dirtier fuels like coal and even natural gas. That's important because President Biden's plan also calls for electrifying things like cars and trucks that currently burn fuel. Biden wants to spend $174 billion to move the U.S. rapidly toward electric vehicles. That requires boosting manufacturing of those vehicles here in the U.S. Right now, they're mostly made overseas and with foreign parts. Biden also plans to build a network of 500,000 electric vehicle charging stations on America's roads. The money would also go toward converting the government's own fleet of millions of vehicles to electric, plus at least 20% of school buses.
The federal government owns an enormous fleet of vehicles, which are going to be transitioned to clean electric vehicles and hydrogen vehicles right here in the United States of America by American workers with American products.
But all of those vehicles running on electricity instead of gas means we'll need a whole lot more power, something the electric grid is currently not ready for. So Biden proposes $100 billion to modernize the grid and to improve its resilience to extreme weather events, like last month's storm in Texas. Those events will become even more common due to climate change.
Honestly, we need to add capacity to the grid. We need to make it more resilient, and we need to make it cyber attack proof. We need to make it secure.
Biden wants to use tax credits to help build more high voltage transmission lines and to incentivize energy storage, like massive batteries that can store power from wind and solar.
It's really the one issue in the climate challenge that's not technological. We know how to solve this one. We have really great software that can direct electrons from places where the sun is shining to places where it's not, or places where the wind is blowing to places where it's not.
Biden also wants $213 billion to retrofit American homes, making them more efficient so they don't use as much electricity, while shifting things like home heating and gas stoves to electric so they can eventually be powered by renewable sources that don't emit greenhouse gases. And there's a whole lot more. There's $10 billion to create a new civilian climate corps, kind of like the Peace Corps or AmeriCorps, but to tackle the climate crisis. There's $16 billion to put former oil and gas workers back to work plugging up abandoned oil and gas wells and cleaning up coal and uranium mines. Another $35 billion would go toward research and development for game-changing technologies like hydrogen power, gigantic batteries, and carbon capture, which traps carbon dioxide and stores it underground so it doesn't heat up the planet. $45 billion to replace lead pipes that carry drinking water, and Biden would also eliminate some $20 billion in annual federal subsidies for fossil fuels. Some Republican lawmakers say Biden's plan goes too far by including costly pet projects for the left that they say goes beyond the scope of true infrastructure.
My view about infrastructure is we ought to build that which we can afford and not either whack the economy with major tax increases or run up the national debt even more.
But others think Biden's plan doesn't go far enough. The Sunrise Movement, which advocates for aggressive action on climate, says that so much more is needed to reach the scale of what is necessary.
I have serious concerns that it's not enough to realize the very inspiring vision that Biden has advanced.
That vision sees the U.S. zeroing out emissions from the whole economy by 2050, in line with what climate scientists say is needed globally to avert the worst effects of global warming. It's an enormous task and an expensive one that will change the way Americans live their lives. But Biden says one thing is clear. If the U.S. doesn't spend big now, the chance to act in time will soon be lost.
In Silicon Valley, some of the biggest names in tech are working to increase diversity within their workforce. NBC technology correspondent Jake Ward checked in on their efforts and why it's taking so long.
After the death of George Floyd and nationwide protests last summer, big tech funneled hundreds of millions into diversity and inclusion efforts. Facebook and Google each announced they wanted to increase underrepresented people in leadership positions by 30% within 5 years. But they're starting from a pretty low place. Black workers comprise between 3.7% and 9% of the workforce at major tech companies, according to our analysis of their latest disclosures. The numbers are even lower for technical roles. In leadership positions, also low. And the numbers have barely moved since most companies began releasing statistics in 2014. That discrepancy is prompting outrage from advocates, employees, even lawmakers.
There must be meaningful representation in your companies to design your products and services in ways that work for all Americans. History has shown that you have talked the talk, but have failed to walk the walk.
Oscar Venezi, a recruiter for Facebook, filed a federal equal employment complaint against the company last year for failing to fairly pay, evaluate, and promote him and other Black employees.
At this particular time, I would not tell any of my kids or allow any of my kids or anyone in my family to work in Silicon Valley. They wouldn't get my recommendation, that is.
And why is that?
It's very difficult. It's a difficult environment. It's an uncomfortable environment for minorities and especially for Black families.
We asked Facebook about the complaint. Here's what they said. We believe it is essential to provide all employees with a respectful and safe working environment. We take any allegations of discrimination seriously and investigate every case. Venezi is still at the company. There is a ready source of Black engineers, the nation's historically Black colleges and universities. HBCUs rank high on the list of schools awarding computer science and other relevant engineering degrees to Black students. That's based on data from the American Society for Engineering Education. But companies like Google have come under fire for underinvesting in HBCU relationships and for not adequately supporting the hires they made. We reached out to the best-known tech companies, and they all described either a relationship with HBCUs or ongoing diversity and inclusion efforts. Now, the numbers of Black math and engineering graduates have suffered in recent years. Oscar Barton, head of the engineering department at Morgan State University in Baltimore, says HBCUs need a deeper relationship with big tech to improve those numbers and to create a recruiting pipeline.
The Stanfords and the Caltechs and the MITs, Michigans, they've had that long-standing relationships with companies, and sometimes they have taken on blind faith that student X, because they graduated from University Y, is going to be the right fit. And it does not always work out. We need to be at the table to show that we provide the same experiences as those large, well-known institutions.
And the head of the American Society for Engineering Education says lofty corporate goals can be undercut by the breakneck race for profits in tech.
You talk to a CEO, they're looking for somebody who can make a long-term contribution to a company. They want somebody who has communication skills, teaming skills, strategic thinking skills, can contribute to the firm over the long term. That's what they want. A hiring manager has a very specific need that they were tasked with finding. I need somebody who can do X, Y, and Z immediately.
Venezi says hiring criteria like so-called culture fit wipes out qualified candidates.
If you say culture fit and this person is coming from a HBCU and this person here has only seen Black people on television, or in that sense, it only takes a little bit from one person to say that you're not a culture fit in order for you not to get into a company.
Venezi describes himself as a super fan of Facebook, and he thinks the company can have a meaningful impact on discrimination in tech.
I spent 23 years in the military, so we have struggled with this same issue for a long time. So I clearly recognize the signs when I'm at a company that struggles with diversity, because I've seen it at every company I've worked for since I was 17. But for the first time, I work for a company that I think will really make a change here and make a difference if it's well informed about what the concern is.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here, and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.